And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome back to the TeachThought podcast. If you're a return listener, and if you're a new listener, thanks for joining us. If you like what you hear, we'd be flattered if you would share it with your network and recommend us and review us. As vaccines and the COVID cloud, or the light at the end of that tunnel, seems to be somewhat nearer and perhaps imminent, I want to remind folks that we are still offering workshops and services online and doing that in personalized and innovative ways, as well as looking toward the future and hopefully soon in-person and on-site workshops similar to those that we were doing before COVID-19 hit us about a year or so ago. So if you are interested in our services, please visit wegrowteachers.com and navigate around project-based learning, differentiation, inquiry, growth mindset, lots of things that we can help with, but we'd love to help you if you are so inclined. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, drew@teachthought.com. In this episode, I spoke with Erec Smith, who is a professor at the York College of Pennsylvania and has a couple of other roles that he serves in, as well as being an author of a book called A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition. And his recent article in Quillette is what we used as the sort of center of this conversation. So we defined rhetoric and composition and defined racism and anti-racism as ways to operationalize them for this conversation, and talked about project-based learning and the role of authenticity and how he uses those in his courses, and how he feels like those are tools in the sort of anti-racist activist spirit, even if it is different from, or his views are different from, some of the more left-leaning or vocal or noisy anti-racist quote-unquote activists. And we talked in terms of the bias and development narratives, and even touched on sort of a potential duality of lived experiences for people of color, as well as many of the things that you might anticipate we might touch on in this conversation on this topic. So it was an interesting conversation for me, and I hope it's helpful. All right, Erec, welcome to the podcast. Erec is among other things, and maybe you want to add to this list, Associate Professor of Rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania, and an Associate Director at the Institute for Civic Arts and Humanities, and past Chair of the York YWCA Racial and Social Justice Committee. I would guess that you probably have other things that you're doing as well as being an author of the book that we're going to kind of talk about, the article in Quillette that was sort of based on, that's called A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition. But I'd like you to, if you don't mind, give our listeners a little bit of info on who you are so that they have some context for our conversation.
Okay. Well, who I am. I have been a lot of people, I feel like, in my career. I was going to be somebody who focused on the confluence of rhetoric and Eastern philosophy, specifically Nietzschean Buddhism. I had a lot of interest in that, especially the fact that there's a certain sect of Buddhism that has a lay organization heavily influenced by American pragmatism, specifically John Dewey. So I was very interested in that. But then I started realizing what was going on in the field regarding anti-racism, and the fact that nobody was really talking about the fact that the emperor kind of had no clothes when it came to anti-racism in my field, especially when it comes to the fact that, or the idea that teaching not necessarily a standard English, but what a lot of linguists and rhetoricians call a language of wider communication, right? Which is not very strunk and white standard English, but modern United States English. That was considered oppressive and inherently racist. So when I pushed back on that, civilly, mind you, I was not met with the same civility. So that's when I decided I have to put that other stuff away and focus on this. And that's where the book, Critique of Anti-Racism and Rhetoric and Composition, came from. And that's where my interest in problem-based learning. I mean, I already had an interest in problem-based learning, but then I saw the efficacy of it as an alternative to current anti-racist education in my field. So I decided to focus on that.
And just so folks know, or we can sort of operationalize it, when you say rhetoric and even rhetoric and composition, how do you define those things?
There are many definitions of that. Not everybody is even comfortable with rhetoric and composition. Some people say writing studies. Other people say rhetorical studies. I like rhetorical studies. I feel like it encompasses both the theory of rhetoric and the teaching of writing, composition, and even oral communication. But basically what it means, rhetoric is as simply as possible. This is Aristotle's definition, the ability to discern in any given situation the available means of persuasion, right? Which basically means that, when you're in a certain situation, and this is called a kairos, I'll explain that later. When you're in a certain situation, the audience, your topic, the time of day, right, will dictate what you can say, right? It will call forth and constrain what you can say. There are certain metaphors you may want to use for this audience that you wouldn't use for another audience, even if your message is the same, right? So it's the study of that. It's the study of how we use language to build ideology, nationhood, community, things like that. That's what I'm interested in. The composition part is basically how we write and persuade through writing. Right?
Okay.
Or that's redundant. How we persuade through writing.
So this may or may not be useful as we have this conversation, but it reminds me some of the things that you're talking about, sort of the time of day or your audience and some of those pieces. The idea of code switching, which might be something that somebody might say, you talk one way in front of a certain audience and talk another way. Is that relevant here?
Very relevant. In fact, it's the crux of what I'm pushing back against in the book. People, and I understand the sentiment that code switching is inherently racist because it's basically saying that your preferred way of speaking isn't okay in this situation because that situation is racist, right?
Okay.
And my take is, rhetoric is about context, right? It's about persuading your audience, which means you need as many tools as possible to do that, right? I'm not offended by the concept of code switching. I don't even think about code switching. I don't feel like I even do it, right? But many people do, and, it may be unconscious. There's a level of language accommodation that comes into play too. You want to identify with your audience or have them identify with you to a degree. And, it's a pragmatic step towards persuasion, right? So I take it like that, and other people take it as an erasure of who they are, right? Mm-hmm. In linguistics, there's a difference between language authenticity, right? And I'm forgetting the actual term. But language authenticity is I relate to my language, right? I am my language. And that as opposed to I use language as a tool, right? And if you are your language, then obviously you're going to take the concept of code switching as a cancellation of yourself in certain situations. I see it as I'm going to use whatever available means of persuasion I have to be as effective as possible in this particular situation, right?
Right.
So it really depends on the frame in which you're looking out into the world. Yeah.
Right. So, I suppose this gets at the kind of the heart of identity and the associations of those sort of rhetorical devices that one might use that are associated with those identities, whether or not they actually empirically are or not. But that's sort of the sentiment, right? I am reminded of my interactions and, quite honestly, the interactions of many people. There's, sort of the stereotypical, acting white voice that comics might use, and sort of hip hop or acting black voice or some version of that, right? I was texting or messaging with a very good friend of mine who happens to be a person of color, and he was saying something. It was a joke back and forth about Samuel L. Jackson, some perfume, which is irrelevant, but it was, we're joking back and forth about it, and he was like, I think he used the word, big pimpin' or something like that, which wouldn't be a rhetorical device you would use in an academic setting in almost any case, right? But is that associated with a person's color of skin or their culture or a culture that is transcends color of skin?
Yes. One of my big pet peeves is the inherent essentialism of race in a lot of anti-racist activism and education. I mentioned language or ideology of authenticity. The other one is ideology of anonymity, which means that you're not, you don't match the stereotypical way of talking or writing, right? You don't relate to it anyway. You're not what's called you're not cathected to it. It means you don't consider yourself consubstantial, with that way of talking or speaking. If you listen to current anti-racist pedagogy and anti-racist activism, they would swear that there is one way of being black. Even if they don't think that, that's how their rhetoric is coming off.
Right.
So I try to push back on that in my writing.
Right. Well, there's and you mentioned the Quillette article, the sort of politically or authentically black that Nicole Hannah-Jones references,
right,
and others, right? That again, there's an essentialism that there is one way that white people or black people or whatever people talk, which is of course empirically not true. But then there's sort of it reminds me a bit of like the metaphorical truths, like generalizations, right? And it is an interesting piece to unpack and think through. And I suppose, again, operationalizing and thinking through the pieces that are relevant here of like, how do you define anti-racism and how do you define racist or racism?
Well, the definitions have been changing, haven't they?
Right. Hence the question.
Right. Academics like to change the definition of terms and not tell anyone. It's a kind of sadistic pleasure we have. I'm kidding. The new definition of racism is much more broad. The term for this is often called concept creep, right? A term that we used to know generally has shifted to incorporate more aspects of life and interaction. So now racism moves from discrimination based on somebody's race to systemic racism, meaning that if you're not adamantly opposed to fighting racism in every given situation, you're racist, right?
Right.
So it has nothing to do with intention. It has to do with the fact that you have been born and raised in a, quote, white supremacist society. And because of that, you are inherently white supremacist. And you have to do your work in trying to alleviate that. The issue, however, is the idea in critical race theory that systemic racism is going away, right? It can't be eradicated. So the best we can do is constantly point it out in every given situation. I think that is counterproductive, right? I think if you're looking at every situation as inherently racist, you're not going to create diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're going to create more segregation, more divisiveness. You're going to move us backwards as a society. So that's how I take that. Now, the tenets of anti-racist education that come out of critical race theory, specifically Robert DiAngelo's work, Right Fragility, and things like that.
She's got a new book.
What's that?
She's got a new book.
I know, and I'm currently writing on the fact that she has a new book right now, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the major tenet is the question isn't whether racism happened; it's how it manifested.
Right.
Right. So if you're accused of racism and you're like, how is it racist? That very question is considered proof that you're racist, right? It's the Kafka trap. And I think that is dangerous, for sure. And regarding DiAngelo and her White Fragility and her new book, there's this tacit assumption that people of color can't have these conversations, right? Because they're so sick of racism in America that they're too fragile to have these conversations. When a white person says, explain to me why that was racist, that's taken as an insult or as more racism by people of color. That's what DiAngelo will tell you. I see that as a infantilization of people of color. I see that as a woman getting paid $20,000 every time she tells people how helpless Black people are, right? That's what I see, and I have a problem with that. Her new book is called Nice Racism, right? And something to the effect of how progressive white people actually perpetuate racism.
Right.
And the first thing I said to myself when I read that title was, is this an autobiography? Because she seems to be that very person she's talking about. And, I plan on pointing that out. In fact, I'm trying to write about that right now. It'll probably be an op-ed as opposed to a scholarly essay. But that needs to be discussed.
Yeah, it's such an interesting way in which she approaches, and there's so many things that are concerning, but I read White Fragility and found, if you look at my book, there's all kinds of notes and questions, and like, wait, this logically leads to some weird places and some crazy unintended consequences. I do think that, certainly there are many white people who, I guess many people, but in this context, white people, and having just finished Racecraft by the Field Sisters, it strikes me even increasingly bizarre that we keep talking about people as white and Black and all of that. But that's as a side note, right? But the sort of bizarre set of circumstances in which that her logic goes, and that there are people who certainly are defensive and jump to defense, and there's lots of reasons why. Some of that might be, in fact, racism. I kind of think, and I said this on Twitter because that's where the world lives, and that's where the most important conversations are being had, right? The silliness of it, but I wonder how many people, how this dynamic would change, and what would it take to change this dynamic if somebody on Twitter or not calls me a racist or, a sexist or, a climate denier or whatever you want to. That doesn't offend me. That doesn't, I by default don't think I get into a defensive position. I'm actually much more curious and think, I wonder why you think that. And that would be a great opportunity to have dialogue. And so I wonder, again, how would things change if more people were not scared to be called a racist, and how we can get to a place where that might be actually the state of affairs. I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes sense. And I will say this about DiAngelo. She has a point about what she's calling white fragility. People do run away from these conversations. But Alana Redstone, somebody you interviewed a while ago, says that how do we know the motivation for people's questions or concerns is racial animus? We don't. Maybe they're just concerned because they're being accused of something they had no idea they were doing, which prompts them to say, why do you think I'm doing that? Right? So fragility would say, no, I'm not doing that, and the conversation shut down. Right? People do want to talk, though. However, the request to talk is also being considered white fragility. And I think that's a problem. What's more, white people do not have a monopoly on fragility. I will tell you that right now. One of the reasons why I'm now a pariah in my field is because I dared question the work of a prominent scholar in the field who talked about how we need to deal with the fact that people of color feel, quote unquote, suffocated by whiteness, and that white teachers are inherently a problem. If you feel suffocated by whiteness and you feel some kind of harm with the presence of white bodies, white professors and things like that, that's fragility, in my mind. You're not necessarily a bad person, but you got to work on that.
Right.
All right. I mean, that's the issue is the fragility. The issue is not the fact that the world is the way it is, right? The issue is not the fact that you are in a predominantly white space. The issue is that you're not dealing with it in healthy ways, which is why I embrace empowerment theory, right? Whether you're white or black, you would benefit from enhancing the interpersonal empowerment, interactional, which is, how we basically interact with other people, understand people, coexist, right? And behavioral, which is how we get things done. The interpersonal is the one we keep skipping, right? Whether it's anti-racism education or anti-racist activism, we seem to skip the part where we have self-awareness and self-management. We provide our own secure basis so that we are more able to take risks and things like that. And we're not weakened by things like the presence of white people when we are black people in predominantly white spaces. So that kind of fortification of who we are is imperative to then move into interacting with others and getting things done.
Right. And you mentioned CRT, critical race theory, being in the Quillette piece, being downstream, so you don't really address it head on in that article. And I have been very critical of critical race theory, mostly because of the process. And as you mentioned, sort of the underlying assumption is that racism is inherently present, and I suppose always will be. And at the starting point there, the question is, where is the racism, not is this racism?
Right.
And the latter question in some cases, and I think it is important to be careful or be aware of what seems to be some conflation among the various people who work in this field and the various people who are well-intentioned, trying to be good people. For example, I had a recent Twitter interaction with a teacher. According to the picture on his profile, he's a white guy, and he had basically said something about anti-racism, and I said, which version? And we had a fairly civil back and forth, but it strikes me that so his version and what he had bought into was the Ibram X. Kendi version, and that if it's not that, then it's not anti-racism. And so that conflation of all the way to, I suppose, what do you say, bell hooks and the very origins of critical theory and critical race theory, to the D'Angelos who seem to be pulling from the thread, and Ibram X. Kendi who's pulling from that, but not necessarily explicitly stating it, and then sort of these people who I think don't dive into the complexity of it, don't think deeply about it, but feel like it's the right thing to do to be anti-racist, so I can't be anything but this, and so there's just strange dynamic that goes on there.
Yes, there is. Critical race theory has it's been bandied about these days. There are good things to critical race theory, especially the aspect of intersectionality, which Kimberly Crenshaw coined to deal with legal issues.
Right.
Right. The court and dealing with people as they are, in every given context, and not thinking about people universally as black or white or female or male. People are intersectional. They embody all kinds of different demographics. That's a great idea. It's been taken by contemporary anti-racist activists, however, to basically be a form of ethos. What I mean by that is the more downtrodden intersections you have, the more you are able to speak in a certain situation, the more you're able to get away with being discriminatory against people with fewer downtrodden intersections, right? It's a badge of honor. And it decides who's allowed to talk and who isn't allowed to talk. So the bastardization of some concepts of critical race theory is what we're seeing, right? The theory itself has some interesting aspects to it, and I think it should be a topic of discussion. So I want to throw it outright. I do want to question its application in many situations.
Right. So let's take that then to what you call problem-based learning, and I would we do all this work in project-based learning. It's a bulk of the work that we do with teachers, project-based learning, inquiry-based learning, and I just to clarify, so I would distinguish between problem and project-based learning in that the problem-based learning often lacks an authentic audience, where a project-based learning experience has an authentic audience. And then all of the other things essentially are the same. And there are different ways in which people talk about problem or project-based learning. That's the way that I think about the difference. But the main feature being the inquiry process for us and how we help students to we ask them to create something, develop something, design something, essentially starting at the top of Bloom's taxonomy with some verb and saying, all right, let's create, do, design, develop, and then helping them sort of reach down, if you will, and uncover or discover those bottom pieces of Bloom's taxonomy just in the most simplest form. What do we need to learn and understand and remember? And then doing the middle pieces through the project or the process of problem-based learning, if you want to use that. And the inquiry, that the sort of the idea that we're developing the skill of asking the important questions in any given process to be able to do something effectively being the core of it. And then, of course, there are other pieces. So I'm wondering how that lands and how you might define it differently or think about it differently.
I think using the taxonomy is very interesting. That's not how I go about it. I do problem-based learning as opposed to project, which I define as, solving a real-life problem in the community, right? A project can be, this is a good idea. A project can be preemptive, right? A project can be, there's no problem, but this will make things better, right? Problem-based is there's a problem that needs to be fixed. And we have to figure out together the best way to fix it. It demands what's called reality testing, looking at the world as it is as opposed to how you want it to be, right? You have to do that in order to figure out the best ways to solve a particular problem.
Right.
So when I do this, I have a course called Communication Professional Cultures. And the first half of the semester is about empowerment and everything that goes with that, including emotional intelligence, including adaptive leadership, which is distinct from technical leadership in that it teaches students to be more, adaptable, more flexible, more able to innovate and improvise given a particular situation. It drives home the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all solution to things, right? People want this universal panacea, right? That they can apply to all kinds of different things. That's technical leadership. Adaptive leadership basically acknowledges reality, which is not everything is the same, and you have to deal with certain situations in specific ways that you wouldn't in other situations. After all that, after the first half of the semester in which we talk about that, they then partake in a problem-based learning project about an authentic problem in the community. And for this semester, I'm having them write a recommendation report for a local Rotary Club who's having problems recruiting more members and transitioning to an online world, right? I mean, 2021, 2020 changed things. So they're having problems with that. So the students are going to research the, kind of best practices for solving those problems for this particular Rotary Club, which has its own idiosyncrasies.
Right.
It's not like every other Rotary Club. So they have to look at this problem and do the best they can as a team to solve it. And as I say in the Quillette article, the stakeholders, the people who have the problem, don't need the problem solved blackly or whitely, right? They need the problem solved, which means that people of different race, colors, and creeds need to get together and think pragmatically and collaboratively towards fixing this problem. So identity is kind of transcended there to a large degree.
Right. So you've hit on, and so I think the way that you define problem-based learning and you use the word authentic is consistent in many ways with how we think about it, and again, there are many ways in which people might define and distinguish between the two, but the word authentic is really, really important here, and we really talk about that. So we in our PBL model, we have what we call five levers. The first two are, again, sort of at the core, right? So what we call rich inquiry and authenticity. And then we have autonomy and meaningful assessment and craftsmanship. And all of those are levers which we would pull to sort of impact and grow, thinking and learning, content standards, whatever it might be in that context. But that the authenticity, and I talk about this a lot with teachers, is when we have an authentic audience, it shifts the conversation away from sort of the grades and points, the playing school paradigm, right, towards one of authenticity, which opens the door to the rich inquiry piece, which is we need to know who our audience is. I think you used the word stakeholders. Who's our audience? Who are our stakeholders? What are their needs? How do we meet their needs? How do we know if we've met their needs? And that gets into the meaningful assessment and craftsmanship pieces. And of course, the autonomy is really piece, we pull on that as sort of empowerment. How do we empower them to autonomously manage the process to the extent that they possibly can? Their proximal development, that sort of line of productive struggle. And the empowerment piece brings me to sort of the dichotomy. I talked about this just recently with Ian Rowe on the podcast, but I've also we referenced what Glenn Lowry has called, and I don't think he's the first one, but sort of the bias versus the development narrative. And clearly the empowerment piece is on the development side. So, there's so much there that we can use as tools to be generative.
Yes, for sure. And you mentioned autonomy, right? Which is something a term that I don't always use, but it's a term that I always mean, right? Especially when it comes to the interpersonal aspect, how we see ourselves, how we create and maintain autonomy. Individuality has become a four-letter word in a lot of anti-racist pedagogy, right, and activism, right? Because it doesn't center one's group, it centers oneself, right, as a sovereign individual in a democratic society. That autonomy is anxiety-ridden for a lot of people because they feel like they're on their own. Shelby Still talks about the idea of integration shock when segregation was outlawed. And what he means by that is people realize, oh God, I have my autonomy here. I've been allowed the agency, I've been denied, when going into certain spaces, right? I can go into those spaces now. I have the freedom to succeed on my own. And that was such a new and novel feeling for people that they were shocked by it.
Right.
Still calls it integration shock. And I think that has a lot to do, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole, but I think that has a lot to do with current anti-racism and the demonization of individuality. But long story short, I also embrace autonomy, and I think you have 5 tenets there.
Right.
Rich inquiry, authenticity, autonomy, meaningful assessment, and craftsmanship.
Yep.
I think that's great. I really want to pick your brain about that one of these days.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah. I'm always looking for ways in which we can, look at more examples. And as a matter of fact, going back to Ian Rowe's conversation, he had mentioned, I don't know if you're aware of the Invisible Men podcast that he does.
I'm not.
Yeah. So he and a collaborator, I don't remember his name, they have started creating this podcast, and it also has video where they highlight really empowered, successful people of color. And one of them is a guy named Will Crossley, who I'm trying to get on the podcast, and he runs a school, I think down in Alabama or Mississippi, somewhere in the Deep South. And as I understand it, it is primarily for people of color, and he uses PBL as a central tenet in his work. So, thinking about the ways in which it's done well, and we get we do lots of work around the world with teachers and schools, and frequently get, where can I see this being done well? And that is a problem that, again, another rabbit hole that we don't need to go down here, of consistent and sustained leadership and an application of any sort of pieces in schools. So we don't see it happening very well, but I do think, we're actually going to be doing a workshop that's actually Friday with a group of teachers in California, and one of the things is PBL and how it can help address some equity issues. And I think it's a great opportunity to, again, give that autonomy, build those skills, empower students of any skin color, immutable characteristic, whatever, in ways that they can be generatively grow, which is, I suppose redundant in ways that help them be successful down the road, right?
Yeah. There's you mentioned talking about people of color who are already successful, right, and doing things. I want to make sure I address that momentarily, but I do want to talk about what you said regarding PBL and the projects you talked about for a predominantly Black set of students. Joy Degruy is a PhD who wrote a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, in which she basically argues that a lot of the problems in the African American community, I don't like saying that word because there are various communities regarding African Americans, but she says that there are a lot of people who haven't really dealt with the trauma of not just slavery but Jim Crow. And a way to deal with that is what she calls improvement science. And when she describes it, she's basically talking about problem-based learning, right? Finding real-life situations and solving them together creates a sense of self-efficacy, positive self-regard, the ability to work with others in ways that are productive and healthy, right? And getting things done to improve your life and the life of others. All these things are the most salient aspects of empowerment theory, which is why I embrace problem-based learning in my education and in my activism lately, anyway. Especially when it comes to the work of Joy Degruy and the journalist Ann Applebaum, who also sees, working on real projects at the local level is what we need to do. We need to stop asking questions that are open-ended and crazy and start asking questions about real life situations that need to be improved or solved in our shared community, right?
That's the Ann Applebaum I think I'm familiar with her, but more in the context of like Eastern European affairs.
I just know her as a writer for The Atlantic.
Yeah, I wonder if it's got to be the same person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that aspect of her work, but that's interesting. Huh. Well, there was something else that you said you wanted to talk about that I had mentioned.
Oh, yes. Focusing on people of color who are actually succeeding, right?
Right.
And as opposed to people who aren't. There's this idea, and I wrote a piece for the Heterodox Academy blog about the lack of interpersonal empowerment and how that shapes how people see the world and how people act. And I critique the concept that representation matters. And what that means is, people of color need to see other people of color doing things in order for them to,
Right.
have the confidence to do it. I get that, and I think we should be focusing more on people of color who are very successful. But that also has an inherent infantilization in it, because you shouldn't have to, or this is what I believe, I don't need somebody to look like me doing something I want to do in order for me to try to do it.
Right.
I'm just going to do it because I want to do it, right? I don't care how you look. If I need representation, it's representation of people who are competent in what they're doing and have the same goals that I have, right? But I don't need to see somebody who looks like me doing it. And I think the need for that, as opposed to the want for that, is a sign of disempowerment and not empowerment.
Yeah, it is. It's an interesting conundrum, and I am a big advocate for and try to figure out ways, sort of in an activist sort of role, to think about how can I help build a more high quality and, I guess, plentiful workforce of teachers who are not people who look like me. And to your point, I think it certainly doesn't hurt. I mean, there is some value, I think, in that pursuit, both from the impact in the ways in which you might have some populations who really find that as an inspiration point, or at the very least and this is maybe a non-charitable way to think about it, but they have a narrative that they've bought into the narrative and believe that some of those dynamics of somebody who doesn't look like me, doesn't have my best interest at heart, or all the pieces that might go with that. So having taught in Louisville, Kentucky, in schools one school there that was not, sort of lily white and affluent, which is part of the dynamic in many antebellum cities, Louisville being the case, and I did a podcast and talked about the busing and the unintended consequences there. But I can see real value in the impact of having more people of color as teachers, certainly quality teachers, as well as the generative nature, because those are pretty good jobs, and that would help anybody who might be sort of trying to flourish in life. So trying to get to some of those pieces, and it actually, when you're talking, it makes me think of, are you familiar with John Wood Jr., who does the Braver Angels stuff? Yeah, and John's been on a couple times. Actually, he has, I think, really put his finger on something that I think is interesting. I'm curious how you think about this, is that there are maybe sort of two, certainly more than two, but two main or major sort of ways to think about or black experiences in the United States, right? That there is his version, which was not really exposed to lots of the things that might be traumatic, either because of or actually embedded with the sort of Jim Crow and the results of slavery and civil rights issues. And then his wife, who grew up, very close to him in Los Angeles, but experienced, people getting shot and lots of, sort of trauma. And so there are sort of two, put in scare quotes here, lived experiences, and that those two narratives and those two sort of experiential lives have different narratives from which are more likely to perhaps identify with some of the sort of critical race theory conflation thing, 1619 Project, that narrative, the bias narrative versus the development narrative.
Okay, so the bias narrative versus the development narrative, and that correlates to John Wood and his wife.
Yeah. So, or them being an example of he I think would probably more relate to the development narrative and think yes, and he has acknowledged all of the things that any right thinking or reasonable person would recognize, the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, all of those things, but that we need to really focus. And I don't know if he would be as heavy in that as Glenn Loury, who is very much so in that vein, versus somebody like his wife. And I don't want to put words in her mouth and speak for her, but that somebody who has experienced and grown up with all of those things, the effects at a magnitude of much greater impact on their lives, might be more willing to sort of buy into or feel the power of that bias narrative, and think the development narrative might be important, but you can't ask me to lift myself up by the bootstraps if you don't give me any boots or straps or whatever that analogy is. And I've probably butchered it.
Okay, I see what you're saying. John's viewpoint seems to be derived from a growth mindset, right? I'm going to progress and grow as a person and better myself day by day. Mm-hmm. And his wife seems to, be saying that growth is not possible if I'm bogged down by a racist society.
Right, or somebody, again, not necessarily his wife, but somebody who might have had her similar lived experiences.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. I'm reminded, and I never really know who coined these terms, these versions of freedom in a democratic society, but there's a difference between freedom from and freedom to, right? I am free to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. I'm free to go to the best colleges and, work hard to perfect myself and, helps society progress. And then there's freedom from oppressive forces, freedom from, a white supremacist society that is inherently racist. And those two mindsets make for different life experiences, right? I'm a big Freedom To fan, but I realize that Freedom From is also important. You need them both in a functioning democratic society.
Right.
However, if you're too focused on one over the other, there can be some problems there.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned John Mcwhorter in the article, and so I think that's a criticism of somebody like John Mcwhorter, and I listened to a lot of John and Glenn's discussions and have read quite a bit of John, and lots of it resonates with me. But I can see trying to be sort of thoughtful about this. I can see how somebody who has lived in a world, and again, I don't know exactly how John grew up, but it would seem reasonable to assume that he had some advantages that some other people may not, which transcends color of skin for sure. I mean, that's look at the poor or the poverty in Appalachia here in Kentucky and those kinds of things, right? Right. But that narrative, it's easy for him to say, well, racism isn't as rampant as most people, as anti-racists are making it out to be, and that can feel dismissive.
Well, I would push back and say that it feels dismissive to have somebody like John's experience dismissed, right?
Right.
And one of the things I've also written about this a couple of times, the essentialism of what it is to be Black, and if you raise your hand and say, well, not every Black person feels this way, you are shot down. Mm-hmm. This happened to me, right? By Black people and white people. I had a white person call me a white supremacist. I mean, that blew my mind. But they said that because I dared say this isn't the mindset of everybody.
Right.
Right. There's this idea of what Gayatri Spivak calls strategic essentialism. We all have to be essentialized together right now because we all need to band together to solve this problem, right? But if the problem is systemic racism that, according to CRT, is never going away, then it's not strategic essentialism, it's perpetual essentialism. And I have an issue with that. I think there needs to be a distinction, between individual Black people and their individual experiences.
Yeah, well, and that gets back to the individualism, which is, according to some, and again, there's some conflation there for how people think about this and sometimes weaponize it, right? But there's, those are tenets of white supremacy or white culture, and we've seen some of those examples. It can be really difficult. One of the things that frustrates me is all of the noise around this conversation, and you see the sensational pieces of math is racist from Seattle and Oregon. Yeah, I mean, so there are examples, but I also, just as a sort of cynical skeptic, I'm trying to say, all right, so let me disconfirm what seems to be true. And it's easy. The easiest thing to do is to say, just like people would say racism is rampant, now we could say critical race theory and its sort of narrative is rampant. And it's hard to tell how rampant and how pervasive those things are. There are lots of schools that I work with, and here in Kentucky, I mean, there's certainly some examples I could cite that give me a little bit of cause for some concern in ways the state level curriculum. But in more conservative states, I would say you're much less likely to see many examples of those kinds of things than you are in much more progressive places like Portland, Oregon, or New York City certainly is engaging in it pretty heavily. So, so how do we? One of my big pieces, talk about rhetoric, is the dialogue versus the debate kind of mindset and this argument, which certainly is important, right? But how do we have and improve the level of dialogue in ways that might help us really uncover some of this nuance and complexity?
The interpersonal component of empowerment is all about, being able to go into a situation with what Otto Schwarmer, I think he's technically an economist, but he writes about, emergence theory and things like that. He calls it presencing, entering into something with an open heart, open mind, and open will. If you have a weak interpersonal component, you're always entering into something, protecting yourself, right? You're trying to protect your viewpoint instead of opening up and figuring out and listening to other people, because that's a threat.
Right.
To listen to somebody else is to possibly come across an idea that isn't yours,
right,
which is hard to refute, which causes discomfort and cognitive dissonance, which I would call fragility.
Right.
Right. So fragility is not just a white thing, but I think focusing on the interpersonal component, how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, right, is an imperative first step that we're not taking. Right.
Yeah. Well, and there, I think in one of the pieces of this is the mental health and emotional health of people that certainly relates, but I think about it from a psychology perspective of that fragility, people who are fragile. And to your point, it is not just about racism. So I see it when I ask pointed questions about, let's say, Trump or something like that, from people who are really, they think the left is dangerous, and they've bought into sort of the Fox News, the OAN kind of thing, right? So anything on the left has got to be bad, because and that pushes them into a defensive crouch on anything that's on the right. And so when you ask a question about, let's say, Trump, it's triggering often, right? So it's the same fragility, right? So it's a security, an emotional security, and in that it might be more intellectual security that there's not really, like, a mature person and an emotionally healthy person actually welcomes in some ways the criticism and looks for ways to disconfirm what they're like. I want to be wrong as short a time as possible, and I'm not trying to convince you unless I'm explicitly, that's my goal is to debate and persuade. In most cases, in those dialogue conversations, I'm trying to understand what you're thinking and then make sure that you understand what I'm thinking. And if we don't agree, then fine. But at the very least, that's what frustrates me, is when I'm in a conversation with somebody and they're basically, I don't get the sense they understand me. And I will pursue that until the ends of the earth, which seems combative, but it's not. I'm not trying to convince you, but I don't think you understand what I'm saying, right? And so that to me is, getting back to the emotional health and the insecurity of people being able to have these hard conversations and not be fragile.
Yeah, they don't come to listen to others; they come to defend themselves. Right. That's the goal. Right. I'm going to defend what I'm talking about instead of opening up and listening to you and, figuring out the goal is the truth, right? The goal isn't for me to come out winning, quote unquote, right? The goal is to figure out the best way to interpret society collectively and do our best to progress.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So I was talking with somebody recently, and I was explaining this to him, and this is a person who is a sort of Trump supporter, and I said I'm just trying to mostly understand, and I sort of explained that, and he said, well, so if you take this approach, how can you help the other person, which essentially means how can you convince them that, because I know I'm right, and if they're wrong, then I have to convince them, which would be perceived as helping them. It's like, no, that's not what. First of all, there's a lack of intellectual humility there, but it's also not a discourse that is healthy. So it's such a strange dynamic. And, again, the ways in which I'm trying to think of ways in which we can, I've actually brainstormed on a side project to think of ways we can facilitate some of these conversations through what I would call rich inquiry and have more dialogue that allows us to uncover some of the nuance and complexity. I don't know if there are enough people who are actually interested in that, because I live in a bubble probably that includes more of those people like yourself that are interested in those kinds of conversations, but en masse, our social media and all of the things that are incentivizing us seem to be pushed, going the other way.
There does seem to be a trend towards incivility in conversation, and I don't know. I think there's a level, and when I'm talking about empowerment theory with my students, I incorporate the inherent emotional intelligence in that, and also the inherent rational emotive behavior therapy, which is kind of like cognitive behavior therapy, specifically derived from some aspects of Stoic philosophy. Long story short, the actions, the events, aren't so much the problem as our interpretation of those events, right? And if we can be metacognitive, we can be mindful about how we're interpreting things, there is a better chance of realizing that we're not being attacked, that things aren't, awful right now. It's called awfulizing, right? And that this conversation can be just that, a conversation. Right. If I have a viewpoint and it's proven wrong, I don't feel like I've been attacked.
Right.
I feel like my viewpoint has been proven wrong, right? I don't have that kind of cathexis with that viewpoint. And there are many people who do.
Right. That's their identity.
Right. So to refute that is to deny them.
Right.
I think that's a very unhealthy way of going about life.
Right. Yeah. No, I would agree wholeheartedly. And we could beat on that drum for quite some time. I do want to make sure folks have an opportunity to find you. The book is a critique of anti-racism in Rhetoric and Composition, and we'll link to that as well as the Quillette article, which has links to your heterodox article. But where else might they or should they find you and any of those things?
I have a couple of articles on the Heterodox Academy blog. You can take a look at that. I have a couple of articles in Newsweek. One recently about the what I call a schism in the Black quote unquote community between people who abide by classical liberalism and people who don't trust it and see it as a Trojan horse of white supremacy, right? And that a lot of animosity within the community is along those lines. And that's, that's a relatively short op-ed. So it's a way of looking at, the general ideas I have about that. But that's out there as well as some talks I've done. Basically just Google EREC space SMITH and see what pops up. I may end up regretting that. But yeah, go ahead and do that. Before you do that, though, look at the Newsweek and the Heterodox and the Quillette articles.
Yeah, and EREC, not IC, but EREC Smith. And you're on Twitter, right? You're any other social media?
Basically just Twitter.
Okay. And what's that handle?
It is Erec. I think it's Erec Smith likes rhetoric or something like that. I don't know.
We'll make sure to link it in the show notes. And
yeah, do that.
Yeah, those folks who are listening on Apple or iTunes, which is most of us, and I always say this, they don't let us put live links in the description, so they'll have to go to our websites or another podcast provider that does allow some of those links to be included. So, well, Erec, it's been great to talk, and again, I think it's such an important topic, and how we do this, the anti-racist sentiment intentions, I think in most cases are good, right? I don't think we want to mischaracterize that. My concern is, and I have voiced this and talked about it in several podcasts, is the possible unintended consequences that might be counterproductive, actually. And that illiberalism isn't isolated to that left side, that left quite a bit,
right.
Left. It is, very much alive on the right as well. We're seeing.
I do make that point in the article.
Yeah.
Yes. It's liberalism is fighting a war on two fronts. Basically.
Right.
Is how I put it.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for the conversation.
Thank you for having it with me.
Yeah.
It's nice to be able to talk to somebody.
Right. That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.